Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to talk about how semi-automatic machine guns work. How do they work primarily legally, but also mechanically? Because as it turns out, there are basically two different ways to convert your typical open bolt full auto light machine gun, like these, into a closed bolt legal semi-automatic rifle. And I should say right off the bat, convert is not really the right term, because legally you can't convert a machine gun to semi-auto. In fact, it's a weird quirk of US law that once a gun is a machine gun, and you may have heard this phrase before, once a machine gun, always a machine gun. Once it's legally a machine gun, that frame or receiver can never become just plain semi-auto ever again. There is a workaround though, which we'll get to in a moment. So, there are basically three stages that you have to go through to build a semi-automatic version of a machine gun like these. By the way, these are both semi-auto. This is a semi-auto Polish DPM, and this is a semi-auto Chinese, Canadian production Bren gun on Chinese contract that was then converted to 7.62x39 by the Chinese. It's a really cool gun built up from a parts kit. And we're going to be talking about how that parts kit build thing work. So there are basically three main steps that you have to go through. Number one is you have to make a receiver. Number two is it has to be a semi-auto receiver and not a machine gun receiver. And number three is you have to modify the internal components. Now, number three is predicated on the idea that you have to convert open bolt guns to fire from a closed bolt, which is, strictly speaking, not legally required, but it is the predominant, basically because of liability, threat of courtroom actions, and commonly understood standards, they are always done as closed bolt guns. This video isn't about what the legal definitions are there. This video is about how are these things actually in a practical sense made. If you want to go get one today, what are you going to get? So we're just going to work on the assumption that you also have to convert the gun to fire from a closed bolt. Quick version for those of you who aren't familiar with the difference. An open bolt gun means when you pull the trigger, the bolt is all the way at the rear. You pull the trigger, the bolt will move forward, it will pick up a cartridge, chamber it, immediately fire it, recoil backwards, eject the empty case, and lock in the open position. This is done typically so that there's never a cartridge that's sitting inert in the chamber to avoid cook-offs. So if the barrel gets really, really, really hot, it can be hot enough that a cartridge sitting in the chamber will get hot enough to spontaneously fire. That's a really bad thing, and light machine guns are typically fired a lot. Or at least they need to be able to be fired a lot without randomly shooting on their own. So they're generally always made as open bolt. Closed bolt means when you are ready, when you pull the trigger, the bolt is already closed, there's a round in the chamber, and a striker falls or a hammer falls or something else triggers the primer to be detonated, fires the cartridge, moves backward, ejects the empty case, picks up a new case, chambers it, and locks in place, ready to fire a second time. Virtually all the guns that are semi-auto that you're used to in the open market are closed bolt guns. Open bolt guns are virtually always machine guns. There are a few oddball open bolt semi-autos that date usually back to the 60s, but that's subject for a separate video. So let's start with, how do you make a receiver? Oh man, sorry guys, I should probably put up a disturbing content warning before I show you a receiver that's been mutilated like this one. But at any rate, like I said, a machine gun can never become a semi-automatic rifle or semi-automatic firearm legally. However, a machine gun can become nothing. It can become not a firearm at all, and that's called being destroyed. Now, the standards for what constitutes destroyed have changed over the years, and there have been different standards for destroying a gun in the US versus what has to be done in order to legally import it and have it not considered a firearm. But essentially where we stand today is multiple torch cuts that remove like a 1/4 inch or more of material through specifically chosen, specifically mandated locations in the receiver, which generally are chosen to make sure they include cutting up the most difficult areas to rebuild. So areas like where the barrel attaches, areas like where the locking surfaces are located, that sort of thing. So this used to be an FN Model D receiver, and this is typical of a parts kit cut up. Every different design of receiver differs. They will have different specified places where they have to be cut. In this case, we got 3 torch cuts here with 4 pieces remaining. Now, the reason that I'm showing you this is because this is legally nothing. This is not a gun. None of these are a gun. Put together in a box, they are not a gun. However, A skilled welder, believe it or not, with the right jigs and fixtures can take this and weld it back together. And that is legally considered a manufacture of a brand new firearm. That's not rebuilding this. That's not converting it. This is nothing. This is legally the same as a solid block of steel. And if you put it into a CNC mill and make a gun out of it, it's the same as if you took this and re-welded it. However, you can't just re-weld this exactly as it originally was configured, because then you've just rebuilt a machine gun. You started with a machine gun, you cut it into legally nothing, and then you re-welded it into a new machine gun. What we want to do here is re-weld this into a new semi-automatic rifle. All right, I'm going to use the Degtyarev, the DPM here, as our example for this, because I have a nice set of spare Degtyarev parts that I can use as examples. All right, so in manufacturing your semi-auto receiver, you have to make sure that it can't accept full auto parts. It can't be, in this case, it cannot be a Degtyarev DPM receiver. It has to be your special semi-auto rifle receiver that happens to look very much like a Degtyarev DPM. So in this case, and there are no hard and fast rules about this, by the way, like for example, in the case of an HK, you know that a full auto HK fire control group can't legally fit onto an HK receiver, or else the receiver is considered a machine gun. In the case of the Degtyarev, we don't really care so much about the fire control group, because you can see this is the original one. It's hammer fired, and we'll get to that in part 3. This is a full auto regular DP fire control group, lower assembly. It fits on just fine. However, what does not is the operating rod. So what you have to do is come up with a modification to the design that renders it semi-automatic only, and then you get that approved by ATF. Technically speaking, you don't have to get it approved, but if you build it and then they decide it's a machine gun, then you've made a machine gun. So what anyone doing this commercially, what they do is they take their design, they make one, they register it as a machine gun manufacturer, and then send it to ATF and ask them to determine if it is in fact a machine gun, and then either they get an answer back that says no it's not, or they get an answer that says yes it is, and they have to modify their design more to make it not a machine gun. Now in this case, we have the original fire control bits here, where this op rod has a catch there that hooks onto the sear right there, like so, and that's when you then pull the trigger, boop, this can go forward. This will not fit in my semi-automatic receiver because the rails, the grooves on the inside of the receiver are too narrow to fit the rails on this full auto operating rod. Now, I'm going to preempt people here. Yes, for every stage in this, people are going to go, oh, I could just do X and I could convert it and make it work. And the answer is, yeah, of course you could. You could also build a machine gun from scratch. Wouldn't be legal, but it's not like any of this actually makes something physically impossible to do. So what we're talking about is how this is done in a legal manner. Now, full auto operating rod will not fit. The semi-auto operating rod that came out of the gun originally, of course, this one does fit because it's narrower. The second thing that was done is the notch, the sear notch, was milled off of it so that it cannot interact with an original fire control group. So yeah, I can put this into the gun with this original fire control group, full auto fire control group, but it won't do anything because this will never lock open because there's no notch there. So other guns are going to do this in other ways, whatever makes sense to the specific design. This is, for example, where the shelf on an HK receiver comes from. So you can't take some particularly rusty and grungy old surplus G3 fire control group and clamp it on to your semi-auto HK product. This is also why you can't have the forbidden third hole in your AR or AK receiver. That's the mechanical feature that differentiates a semi-auto receiver from a full auto one. All right, now we have come to stage 3. You've made a receiver, it is legally semi-auto, and now you have to convert the gun to closed bolt. So here's your problem. This is an original DPM bolt carrier assembly. When this goes forward into the gun, it is going to go all the way forward. This hits the breech, the back of the barrel. It pushes back, the locking flaps extend, lock the bolt in place so it's safe to fire, and then, ooh, the firing pin immediately pops out and fires the cartridge. That does not allow you to have the bolt closed with a cartridge in the chamber. So you're going to have to get rid of the fixed firing pin. On submachine gun designs, this is generally a part, like it's a solid component. There is no moving firing pin. There's just a firing pin nub on the bolt face that requires drilling out to remove. On a light machine gun like this, we're fortunate that there's some sort of other mechanism involved, and there is a separate firing pin. So if we're going to do this, we can pull the parts out. There's our firing pin. Well, what Rick Smith did for the Semiauto DPM is, first off, he cut the firing pin off the firing pin. So this is now just a spring guide. Here's his bolt, and he has added a replacement firing pin right here. It comes up through the bottom. The geometry just perfectly fits in there. All right, now we have our closed bolt assembly here. It works the same way. It still locks into battery when it closes because it is these two parallel surfaces that push the locking flaps out, and they're still present on this shortened, neutered firing pin. But now, once it's in battery, the firing pin's still just sitting there waiting, and it's waiting until something hits it down here. Then it fires. And the really cool thing about Rick's fire control mechanism is that he managed to take a tiny little amount of space like this and actually engineer a hammer-fired trigger that fits in it. So this is the hammer that's going to come up and hit that firing pin. If I pull the trigger here, if I take the safety off right there, when I pull the trigger, that snaps forward. Oh, and it's a really heavy spring to make sure that it fires reliably. But that's your hammer face right there, and then that is your semi-auto disconnector. So this is one way that open bolt machine guns can be converted, and that is namely by converting them to be hammer fired with a mobile firing pin. So I mentioned at the beginning there are two general ways that this sort of conversion is done. This is one of them, adding a hammer fired fire control system like this and a firing pin to work with it. Now my semi-auto Bren gun works in a different way. On the Bren gun, and by the way, this is a gun that was originally made in Inglis in Canada and cut into a parts kit and imported, and then that receiver has been re-welded quite well, but you can still see a little bit of discoloration right there where one of the welds was. This has been rebuilt as a new semi-automatic rifle, which of course required a closed bolt conversion in this case, and this one works totally differently. So it has its own set of receiver denial areas, blocks that we won't get into here, but when I pull the lower off of this, there's like, oh my goodness, what's all of this coming out? Yeah, there's a lot of extra stuff here that is not normally supposed to be found inside a Bren gun. So the way the Bren gun normally works is very similar. It has a recoil spring here. It's captive inside the stock. Then it also has a moving firing pin, and the way this originally worked is that the firing pin extended only to right here. When the gun went fully into battery, the surface here on the op rod would hit the firing pin and push it forward and fire. Now, what they did on this is make a new firing pin that comes all the way back here, and you can see they milled out the center of this tower so that it can nest over the firing pin right in there. Now, the important element of the firing pin, the exposed part, is back here, and when I push that, it fires. Then they manufactured what we would probably technically call a linear hammer, so sort of a striker, and this sits at the back of the bolt like so in the receiver. You can see it's got a rail here where it runs on the same rails as the bolt carrier. This now acts as a hammer or striker. So the advantage to this system is there's a lot less change made to the fire control group. That still looks like a full auto open bolt firing mechanism, and that's because it basically is an open bolt firing mechanism. The difference is it's not holding the bolt back, it's only holding this linear hammer back. So it runs like this, and when I pull the trigger, that sear drops. This linear hammer can go forward. It's going to trip the semi-auto disconnect right here on its way forward. It's going to come up, smack the firing pin, fire the gun, and then the whole thing, all three of these parts, will reciprocate backward, eject the empty case. The bolt and carrier will go forward. They'll chamber a new round and then sit there while this linear hammer is caught behind the sear again. So if you're familiar with the Bren, you know that these two parts are not native to the Bren gun. There's not supposed to be a second spring in there. There's only supposed to be this spring going into the stock, and then this is just a guide rod for this spring. And the reason is, if you're going to do a conversion this way, there has to be a second spring to power this linear hammer. You need one to power the bolt and push it forward, and a second one to power the striker, the hammer. So that's what this guy is, and they found space for it. So they had to add a hole in the stock up there. So there's space for this spring to nest down in. And it goes a ways in there, but then it has to compress a bunch, and it's kind of a pain to put back together. It's kind of fiddly. But that is your second method. So essentially, the two ways projects like this are done are either by converting the fire control mechanism and leaving the bolt carrier mostly intact, or by converting the bolt and carrier and leaving the fire control mechanism mostly intact. But these both accomplish the same end goal of converting an open bolt firing gun into a closed bolt one that can be recognized as a plain semi-auto rifle only. Now, I should also point out there are a decent number of machine guns that are closed bolt firing from the beginning. The most classic one being the Browning system. The 1919 medium machine guns, the M2 heavy machine gun, they all work on the same basic principle, and those are closed bolt guns from the beginning. And that's why those tend to be some of the most predominant semi-automatic machine guns that you will actually find out on the market, because none of this stuff has to be done to those. You just have to make a new receiver that's semi-automatic only, and then block it so that the original full auto components won't fit. There have been some more esoteric, exotic light machine guns that were closed bolt. A good example of that would be the Madsen light machine gun. There were a batch of Madsens made by a company called Midwest Metal Supply. They're really cool. They're great semi-auto Madsen guns, and they fire from a closed bolt because the Madsen was originally a closed bolt. Because of all of the work that you just saw explained, semi-auto machine guns have always been a relatively scarce niche thing. There aren't very many companies at all that are interested in making this sort of thing from scratch. FN's 249 is a fantastic counterexample. Most of them come out of the shops of small scale to medium scale gunsmiths, but it takes a lot of invested work for guys like that to figure out how to make this sort of thing cost effective and reliable for the shooter. The closed bolt conversions can be tricky. Re-welding receiver pieces requires jigs and fixtures and tooling and a level of expertise that takes time to develop. And so they've always been fairly scarce guns. There have been a few types that kind of come to prominence, and they will generally exist and be available while parts kits are available. Unfortunately, during the Obama era, change in import rules prevented us from being able to get original barrels. That's when they had to start cutting barrels as well as receivers. Barrels for a lot of these guns can be very difficult to make because they have odd profiles. They have fixtures on them like carry handles. Where'd it go? Like carry handles, and that sort of thing. So these are less prominent now than they were 10 years ago. But they can be really cool guns to shoot, and they can be really good options to have an example of a very cool, very relevant historic firearm without having to deal with the National Firearms Act, the cost of transferrable legal machine guns, and all that sort of stuff. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. This was a fun one to do. Thanks for watching.